This is Todd Nielsen, the president and owner of Clocktower Advisors. And this is another one of our video podcasting series around people that are doing interesting work in online communities in the digital workplace. I have with me today as a guest, Joy Stephan, who is the founder of 20 Chairs. And she's going to be talking to us a little bit about her work in building sustainable, thriving communities, particularly in workplaces. She's had a lot of other interesting experience around things like digital fundraising and customer experience, doing some research in those areas. So we're sure to have a bit of a wide-ranging conversation about this. And I want to go ahead and welcome Joy to the podcast here. Welcome, Joy. It's nice to see you.
Thanks, Todd. Nice to be seen.
So Joy, you and I met up a couple of weeks ago. It was something coming out of some panel discussions and stuff that I had done with Vanilla. And we kind of hit it off in the conversation. I'd asked if you'd be willing to be interviewed for my informal video podcast show, which I really appreciate. Can you maybe give a little bit of a thumbnail about how you ended up in the community space, so to speak?
Sure. So I've been building communities for about 20 years now. The first communities that I built were actually walkathon communities. And that's a theme that you'll see come back later on in the conversation. But that's my origin story. Started with launching walkathons, moved into what I describe at cocktail parties as organizing good deeds and giving away money in my function for a financial services firm, which was in community relations and employee engagement. Employee engagement also introduced me to organizational change management and the important role that plays in building long-term, thriving, transformative communities rather than the scorched earth kind of communities that leave you afraid to go back to them. And through that work, I eventually was direct guided, I suppose, by some of my earliest clients who had an interest in building community in their workplace and in their office buildings. So since then, I've been focusing primarily on helping commercial and corporate real estate leaders to understand the people that occupy their buildings and to design spaces that support their productivity, their thriving, and their retention, both of talent and tenants.
So I'm incredibly interested in your entry to communities because the work that I've done in online community building generally doesn't start with sort of the live in-person kinds of communities. It starts with trying to bring people who are very geographically dispersed in most cases together into a virtual space where it's a little tougher to build sort of that face-to-face trust that you can get, sort of in these live situations. But I'm really interested in kind of some of the lessons that you've learned from working with sort of space design and the kinds of activities and interactions you're trying to engineer to foster that sense of community. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about that? My experience has, by and large, been in online community building, but I'm interested in your take on coming in and building physical spaces for communities and what's been involved with that.
I think what we're finding both with digital communities and place-based communities, as I call them, is that one hand feeds the other. You reach a certain point of growth in a digital community and you crave a certain in-person or a deeper face-to-face connection. The same thing sort of happens in the reverse, where people can connect initially face-to-face, but then often they want to continue a conversation beyond the confines of a certain, of the time that they have. And then that leads them into the digital realm. Similarly, especially when you're dealing with fundraising elements, you may come together around a certain interest or cause that resonates with you, but then you realize like, well, I'm doing this, but so are other people. And I wonder what they're doing because I'm trying to do this for the first time and I don't necessarily have all the confidence that I need. But by finding a digital community or, working to develop a digital community that's going to support them when they're trying to build teams and trying to send messages, they're able to deepen their engagement both with the organization and with the other people that they're trying to bring together by seeking out resources and relationships digitally. So, but in terms of looking at the spaces and reimagining what those may look like. I think a lot of the work that I do with real estate is helping them to understand that, just because you build it, people won't necessarily come. People would rather do nothing than to do something wrong as a general rule of thumb in the workplace. So you kind of need to tell them what you're going to tell them what you're going to tell them again, and tell them what you've told them. It also helps to have champions at a senior at a senior level that understand what you're doing and why you're doing it, are willing to adapt some of their behavior. It's one thing to ask somebody that's 2 years out of college that wants to get noticed for doing the right thing to do something differently, but a senior executive that has always sat behind a desk and is suddenly being asked to bring his laptop into a cafe when he still doesn't understand why he's given a laptop because he has a standalone desktop. Very different conversations.
Sure.
So the work that I do really is about helping people at every level of an organization to understand why we're doing what we're doing, the impact we want it to have, listen to the receptivity to what's happening and why it's happening, and then find an entry point for them. For some people, it's going to be a lead by example. And for others, it's going to be hey, can you just make an announcement at your staff meeting? And then when they start to see that really made a difference, and then they start to have conversations in staff meetings, then again, conversations get started that wouldn't be happening otherwise. Mm-hmm. So really the foundation of any community is the conversations that take place within it. The more animated your conversation, the stronger the community.
So those principles, I think come up again and again with virtual communities as well. And so it's kind of interesting to hear your perspective of that sort of, in those physical workspaces, as well as those communities of place, as you call it. I like that name you've got for it. So when you come in and consulted with some of these, not necessarily the real estate companies, but other organizations you've worked with as well, what are some of the common issues you see that are obstacles to community building in the physical spaces that you're going into?
I mean, really, there's just a recognition that there's a knowledge gap between the facilities that people are providing and the human behaviors that they're prompting. Typical first engagement would sound a little bit like, we have a space and either we haven't designed it yet and we want it to be designed in a way that takes into mind certain goals and objectives that we have, or we built a space with certain goals and objectives in mind, but we don't know if the humans are doing the things that we want them to be doing. Can you tell us? Because we know how to make contracts with bricks and mortar, but we don't know anything about the people that operate inside them. And they're starting to recognize that without that there's a knowledge gap there that's going to get in the way of them making the best decisions with their financial,
Sure.
with their coffers.
Your process of doing that, are you interviewing people at different levels of the organization to kind of understand what they're looking for, or what kinds of things that they're seeing as obstacles to them getting their work done?
Yes. So there's a circumstance where if somebody says, we want to create a place that has a slightly different vibe and we want people to be productive in it, though we don't want them to be goofing off. We want to make sure that they're being productive. So I start a conversation with a very easy icebreaker. And this is something that I do with landlords regularly. Bring in 20 different people. We put together a hit list of the types of people that we want in the room with certain requirements of a combination, diversity of levels, diversity of departments, diversity of seniority with the company. And before we get started, we're like, let's make sure that everybody is here so that we can have as inclusive a representation as possible. And right out of the box, it's like, we make it clear that just because you like to work one way, that doesn't mean that you're going to walk in and find your utopian workplace. And we illustrate how complex a utopian workplace is by going around the room and saying, so when you're not at your desk, where are you the most productive? And you get answers from people as far ranging as on my couch, lying down, music blaring with my computer in my lap, to in the janitor's closet, hunched over because I cannot get distracted with no sound. And please, now that I've told you all where I go when I need to answer a whole bunch of emails really quickly, don't follow me in there. It means I'm really in trouble and I got to get out. So it creates a stronger sense of inclusiveness by recognizing, like, yeah, we all work differently. So knowing that, what are some of the common threads that we can pull through to find an environment that's going to work for a vast majority of the people that work here? And then the conversation becomes much less about, like, well, obviously I have the answer. You just need to work the way I work, to right. Well, what if we did this? And how about if we try that? And recognizing that we're going to need to accommodate a variety of different needs, not just theirs, which already is a massive change in terms of mindset from what they go in. Like, they go into the meeting to make sure that their needs are met. And by the time they've left the meeting, they're thinking about the complexity of what's going to happen. And they're just hoping that something that they wanted shows up.
It reminds me, so that whole idea of people, having their own work styles and what they do. I can't remember where I read this some years ago, but it was somebody talking about you should almost provide an operator's guide for anybody who's going to work with you, because everybody does have sort of their own way of approaching things. What I'm hearing from you is that it's really not just about the physical workplace, but it's about sort of how people are coming to that workplace and engaging with each other. And so maybe that physical space can shape things a little bit, but it's also about maybe being a little more clear about the intentions of how you intend to work with others in the workplace as well. Is that space in which you play? Certainly
how you work with others, how when you work in this space, you may work differently than you did in your old space, sort of have that conversation. One of the other things I try and encourage is there are some managers that operate in traditional ways and some that operate in more progressive ways. And so if you're trying to introduce a more progressive way of working or a future of work model based on activity-based working, and the first people that you move into the office are diehard traditionalists, the overall success of the project is not as likely to be strong as if you look for some of the outliers in the current work environment that are doing progressive things that other people may be kind of giving a side eye to, and moving them into the workspace first and seeing how they're using things like group norms. Like, a group norm is not something that you find, list is not something that you find when you walk into most traditional cubicle spaces. But when I find one of those folks, I'm like, I want him to move into the new space first. I want to have a conversation there. And rather than me saying, here's a guidebook on how to work going forward, I talk to him and others like him or her. And I say, I noticed that you have this. Tell me about this. And if you could get your peers in a room together, what would be most important for them to know? And how have you tried to influence people within your organization that may not report to you, so that some of the norms when they come into your area are adopted, and basically making them aware of where their levers are to affect change, even in their smaller organization, so that when they move in, they feel empowered because they feel like they've been doing something right, because they've had a conversation that appreciates it rather than gives it a side eye.
Well, it sounds like amazing and interesting work. And this, of course, comes to me because I work in the digital workplace. How much awareness is there of how sort of that digital workplace experience needs to kind of be married to sort of the physical workspace experience as well? Is that coming up a lot with your clients at this point?
I think people are still looking at it very separately because of the way that the hierarchies, the way that the org charts are structured. I've been a champion from early on, since one of the first real estate clients that I worked with, real estate reported to HR. And in some circumstances, they had a dotted line report from IT as opposed to finance, because if you think about everything through the lens of the human experience, that's going to impact real estate and the IT services that you provide very differently than if you're looking at it through a financial bottom line lens. In all circumstances, these are cost centers. They're not revenue generating, right? But cost centers always need to demonstrate how they're adding value, right? And so if you're reporting to finance, you're going to be talking about how you're minimizing cost. And when you're reporting to HR, you're talking about how you're adding value. And they're very different conversations that float up to the CEO very differently. And if a CEO is focused on culture, it absolutely makes sense for the org structure to be inclusive of both the digital and the physical, and as it pertains to not only their employees, but also to their customer base.
Who is usually driving this engagement? Like in your experience with the customers who've come to you, is it usually the C-suite that's approaching you about the building community in the workplace?
I have not had the same circumstance twice. I'll be perfectly honest. The first building that I worked with, it was a property manager that, we'd worked together for 18 months, and then we talked about doing something more substantial and he needed more budget. And I said, because I told him what it was going to cost. And he said, oh, well, I can't afford that in my budget. I said, great. So who do we need to talk to next? And that's how I got to the C-suite in that circumstance.
Got it.
And really, but the conversations I was having there were conversations nobody had ever had before. You had folks on one side of the room that were focused on cutting costs, and the other half of the room was focused on adding value. And I just sat there and I listened to everybody's job description. And I said, who represents the tenants? Because I expect that they would be the tiebreaker in some of these circumstances. And they all just kind of looked at each other and had no concept of what I was talking about. So for them, I was introducing the idea of a customer experience. They were like, well, we work with our brokers, and then once they sign the lease, then we have them for a very long time. And I'm like, yes, but how are you making sure they want to stay? Because last time I checked, it's really expensive to move out a tenant and move another one in, not to mention the marketing costs and all of these things. I'm like, it seems as though it would be much less expensive to ask them what their priorities were and to really laser focus on those. Oh, well, they don't know. Got it. And over the course of our engagement, they started to discover, in fact, how much they did know and how some of the solutions that tenants came up with were even more cost effective by a lot than what they had in mind. So once I was able to demonstrate how we could cut costs and add value, then they were much more interested in talking to me than they were initially. But I've had other circumstances, mostly working with membership associations, where I have been engaged with the CEO from the very start because they understand community. And often when I engage with them, it's because they have inherited a culture that they're not entirely satisfied with. So they'll take a job and they'll say, I don't want to go back to the events that that my organization has been holding, either digitally or in person. Can you work with me to help change the conversations that we're having so that this is an association that people do want to keep coming back to, where they do feel as though they can forge meaningful relationships that do add value to their business and to their lives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of it depends on the client, but certainly when I'm working with clients that are unfamiliar with customer experience, having that internal champion at any point is helpful. And obviously the higher you go, the greater an impact you can make. But, I think in the same way that some digital communities are inwardly focused and others are externally focused, in some circumstances, you'll engage with HR. In others, you'll engage with marketing. Some other ones, it's going to be corporate affairs. I'm sure that digital communities are going to continue to move around the org chart for another 10 years based on what I saw in corporate social responsibility.
Yeah, that's been my experience too.
Yeah.
I was just kind of curious if it reflected, and it sounds like it does, these in-person, kinds of place communities as well.
I think they share a lot of, what I've seen is that they have a lot more in common, both in terms of their challenges and in their opportunities, than they have differently. Certainly just like there are technical aspects that are going to be different. The fundamentals about why community is important and valuable is the same, whether it's one or the other. And wherever you start, eventually there's going to be a call to balance it with the other, just because that's how we live these days.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to ask you about what keeps you engaged in doing this kind of work. You know, those of us that get into the community building space, I find in general we're pretty outgoing people. We like to connect people. We kind of get some enjoyment from that. But it's hard work, and there's art and science involved with, I used to teach at the college level, and you never knew what the classroom was you were walking into, what the exact chemistry was of the interactions there. And I mean, you can try to engineer things, but sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So, so I was kind of curious, what keeps you coming back, to doing this kind of work?
I think for me, it's recognizing the ever-growing opportunity for communities to shape how we work, live, and play. I mean, I think I've certainly not been a lifer that's just focused on one type of community. For me, it's been the variety and the diversity of communities that I've been able to work with that's given me the mental stimulation. I love being able to learn about the different applications and the different industries that I get to work in are infinitely fascinating. I don't know many people that get the opportunity to work in every single sector, which I have, to make social impact in a corporate environment and to make financial impact in a nonprofit environment. I mean, these are really different goals and outcomes, but being able to use the consistent structure and levers of community has allowed me to pick up my set of tools and move them from one environment to another and add value wherever I go. So I think that's what keeps me engaged. I know there are some folks that imagine they can build a community for 20 years. That is not who I am. I am a 3 to 6 year cycle girl. So I like having clients that I work with for a very long time, but I like having a variety of different projects that I work on.
Sure. Well, I can certainly appreciate that. And I mean, I think that's what's kept me in consulting all these years too, is I like the variety. I like the challenges of working with different customers in different sectors with different challenges. And I don't know if this has been your experience too, but I think working in sort of those different kinds of sectors and areas allows you to bring perspective from one area to another, or insights or clarity to situations that you might not have otherwise had if you were only working in that one space for 20 years. I think it's part of the value of being consulting.
100%. I think it would be a pretty hard sell if I stood up in front of a room of financial services executives and gave a talk about what launching walkathons taught me that would help their financial services business. However, I probably wouldn't structure it that way for them. But what I would do is talk about sort of the universal truths of reciprocity and give and take, and how you can create an environment that supports those types of values, and the types of questions that you ask that distinguish sort of a volunteering from a voluntelling mindset. And those are universal.
Yes, very true.
Sure, you can volunteer a dozen people to show up, but it's not going to get them to keep coming back. I would much rather have the people with the intrinsic motivation to show up, to have a positive experience and come back again and again and again. And then I set them up to empower them to lead what it was that they were interested in the first place. And that has application whether you're dealing with employee resource groups or walkathons, or how are we going to work in this pod, or this neighborhood, depending on the term that a given real estate person gives it. Basically, how are we all going to work together in a way that works for the most of us?
Well, Joy, your company is 20 chairs, and you've been running it since 2011. What's behind the name? And if someone's interested in working with you, how is your organization able to help?
Great. So I love talking to people about communities, full stop. And about challenges that they're having with their business. And the truth of the matter is, I can't tell you. I can tell you things that I've done, but most of the ways that my engagements have started is what's happening with your business? Why is that important to you? What would it look like if it were different? And if it sounds anything like a community, then I end up saying, I think I might be able to help you with that. And we talk about where we might start and the journey. You know, there are tools that I use in every scenario, but they've always been adapted to the individual needs. As for where the name came from for 20 chairs, there was a philosopher named Bertrand Russell who observed that if you put an object in the center of a room and 20 people in chairs around it, everybody would have a different understanding of the object. And it's only by sharing all those perspectives that you understand what's going on with the whole. So what 20 chairs does for me and the clients that I work with, it sort of reminds and reinforces us throughout an engagement that every point of view is valid, important, and incomplete by itself, and that we're all together so that we can understand the whole.
That's a really wonderful, thoughtful name organization. I love it. I think it's terrific.
Thank you. Also 20, because people go, how many chairs is it? And I go, well, I ask a lot of questions. So I'm like, you remember the game 20 questions, 20 chairs. And it's also the point in anthropology where they say a group can it's the tipping point between where a gathering of people becomes a tribe.
That too.
And my earliest engagement started with about 20 people in a room. So
that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Well, Joy, I really appreciate your time and giving me the chance to interview you and learn a little bit about what you do. It's adjacent to and different, and yet, you know, seems to bear so many similarities to the stuff that I do in the online community space. I'm really grateful for your insights, and I'm sure, you know, some of our viewers will be too. If somebody wants to check out your organization, your website is 20chairs.com. 20 chairs, 20 is the number, .com, or they can email me directly at joy@20chairs.com. Either way, I welcome any conversation about community or any business challenge, because I think that a lot of people don't realize all of the ways that a community can move business forward in ways that they think that they can't. So. Well said. Joy, thank you for being on the show, and thank you for tuning in. If you haven't already, I would ask you please like this video and share it with any of your friends that you think would find it of interest. And stay tuned for more interviews with people that are doing interesting work around communities, whether in person or online. This is Todd Nielsen with Clocktower Advisors, and I'll see you again soon.